She looked like a ghost wandering through fire. Emily's tiny frame shuffled down the blistering sidewalk, her bare legs quivering beneath a white shirt far too big for her. The sun blazed overhead, casting cruel shadows that danced along the cracked pavement. Cars crept by, their drivers glancing sideways, some curious, others disapproving. As the little girl walked alone, her fists gripped the pink backpack straps until her knuckles turned white, her gaze glued to the ground. She refused to look up. The shame pressing down on her felt heavier than the bag on her back. From a nearby bench, a voice whispered loud enough to slice the air, "Where are her pants, poor thing?" Emily's throat seized, but she forced herself to swallow the lump rising fast. She had made a promise. No crying. Not here. Not where they could see, but the journey home had never felt this long. Each step echoed with the teacher's cold decree. If you're not following the dress code, you can't stay. Her knees buckled, but she didn't stop. Just 3 blocks more. Grandpa would be there. He always was. He made things okay. What Emily didn't know, not yet, was that someone else had made a promise that day too. One that would leave no room for apologies. No room for humiliation without consequence. No one shames Chuck Norris's granddaughter and walks away. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story strikes a chord, don't forget to subscribe. Out in the yard, Chuck Norris moved like a man at peace. His shears clipped through rose stems with careful precision, deliberate, focused. Gardening was his meditation. The roses, like life, demanded respect. Beautiful, yes, but every petal came with thorns. A cloud drifted overhead, dimming the sunlight, and something in the air shifted. A sensation he hadn't felt since places far from here. Battlefields, backlots, situations where instincts kept you alive. Then he heard her voice, small, shaken. A grandpa. He turned and saw her, pantsless, trembling. The moment froze, and something ancient stirred in him. Not the performative anger of the silver screen, but the primal fury of a protector, a guardian wronged. But he didn't let it show. Not yet. Emily didn't need rage. She needed strength. "Emily," he said softly, "what happened, sweetheart?" Wrapped in a blanket now, safe on the couch, her scraped legs covered by fresh leggings, Emily recounted it all. The shame still clung to her skin like frost. Her grandfather listened, silent, unreadable. Unlike her parents, Mom would be sobbing, Dad pacing, Chuck remained still, a stillness that unsettled her more than yelling ever could. "And Joey," she added, her voice barely a whisper, "he's the one who spilled the water. He didn't get in trouble. Mrs. Peterson said it was an accident." The wall clock ticked, measuring the quiet like a slow metronome. Through the window, sunlight glinted off the garden shears he'd abandoned earlier. "Should I call Mom and Dad?" she asked hesitantly. Chuck shook his head. "Oh, no. They're presenting at the conference. We've got this, you and me." Emily's eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion pulling her into sleep. Chuck watched her fade into dreams, then stepped out onto the porch. Phone in hand, he dialed a number rarely touched. "Mike, it's Chuck. I need a name check on a teacher at Westwood Elementary. Peterson." Today, back inside, Chuck studied the child sleeping on the couch. Behind her hung a photo of his Special Forces unit, a life most had long forgotten. The years before Hollywood, before fame. The years that taught him how to disappear, how to strike, how to protect. He checked his watch. 2:15 p.m. School would still be in session for another hour and 45 minutes. Plenty of time. Chuck reached for a small notebook and began to write Emily's story, word for word, while it was still fresh. His pen carved the page with crisp, controlled strokes. But by the end, his grip had tightened, turning his knuckles pale. With care, he set the pen down, flexed his fingers, and turned toward the window. His eyes locked on the road to Westwood Elementary. The sunlight carved long shadows across the grass, all of them pointing like arrows toward the school. He grabbed his keys. Inside the principal's office, tension ticked like a time bomb. Principal Roberts adjusted his tie as Mrs. Peterson paced back and forth, each step slicing across the carpet. "I followed protocol. Hank," she insisted, voice tight with frustration. Her pants were completely soaked. She couldn't stay in class like that. "And so you sent her home, wearing only her shirt?" Roberts pinched the bridge of his nose. It was long enough, mid-thigh. I've seen older girls wear less in the summer. Did you contact her guardian? I tried, Peterson replied, smoothing her immaculate skirt. I left a message. The girl said her grandfather was watching her this week. I assumed he was retired, probably home. You assume. The words dropped like bricks between them. Neither noticed the faint shadow that passed across the frosted glass door. Neither heard the footsteps pause. Amanda, the principal, said, leaning in, "We have extra clothes in the nurse's office. That's what they're for." Peterson's spine straightened. Those sweatpants are disgusting. They never get washed. It's unsanitary. Roberts's brow lifted. More unsanitary than making a 7-year-old girl walk home half-dressed? Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. I've been teaching for 27 years, Hank. I don't need a lesson on what's appropriate. Just outside the door, Chuck Norris stood motionless, listening, waiting, and what he heard next would decide exactly how far he was willing to go. Chuck controlled his breathing like a sniper lining up a shot, shallow, even disciplined. He didn't move. Only his eyes shifted, narrowing in on the nameplate on the office door. Amanda Peterson, 2nd grade. Inside, the principal's voice broke the silence. So just to be clear, Roberts said. Emily's pants were soaked because another student spilled water on her. Yes, Amanda Peterson replied without hesitation. Joey Parker said it was an accident. I see no reason to doubt him. He comes from a good family. He comes from a good family, Mallister? The principal asked carefully. What kind of family is she from? Peterson waved the question away like a gnat. Oh, single mother. Father's somewhat involved when he's not traveling for work. Not exactly a stable environment. Chuck's jaw tightened. Just enough to crack a walnut if one were nearby. Down the hall, a water fountain hummed to life, its mechanical buzz momentarily distracting him. Something predictable, something to focus on instead of the surge roaring in his ears. Amanda? Roberts tried again, caution edging into his tone. What if someone saw her like that? What if a parent calls? Well, then I'll explain it logically, she replied, her voice clipped. The girl was disruptive, giggling during silent reading, passing notes to Sophia. This was just the last straw. Did you document any of that? The principal asked, leaning back in his chair with a creak. I don't need to log every little misstep, Hank. This isn't a courtroom, but out in the hallway, Chuck Norris was turning it in at a 1. A quiet courtroom of the mind where every word was weighed, every fact scrutinized. Emily's tears, the teacher's condescension, the principal's passive questions. All of it logged, recorded, judged. Well, Roberts finally muttered, what's done is done. Hopefully she returns this afternoon properly dressed and we can just move forward. Exactly, Peterson agreed, her shoulders easing. But children need to learn consequences. Her mother coddles her. That was enough. Chuck stepped back, melting silently down the corridor toward the school's main entrance. His weathered hand brushed the visitor sign in sheet, but he didn't lift the pen. Not yet. First, reconnaissance. He needed to see the classroom, understand the terrain, assess the battlefield before he made his move. Back in the office, the conversation continued, blissfully unaware that the storm had already passed through. Silent, unseen, judging them from a place forged by trials far harsher than this school's air-conditioned halls. Inside the classroom, order reigned. Neatly arranged desks. The steady scratch of pencils on worksheets. Mrs. Peterson's heels ticked across the linoleum in perfect rhythm as she walked between students. But her eyes kept drifting toward the empty desk by the window. Emily's desk. No matter how she tried to ignore it, the absence pulsed in the corner of her vision. 5 more minutes for your math problems, she announced, casting a quick glance at the clock. 2:45 p.m. Emily should have been back by now. A flicker of unease twisted in her gut. She pushed it down. Children needed structure, rules, consequences. That's what shaped them into functioning adults. She caught Joey Parker's gaze. He smiled, angelic. His math worksheet was already completed, answers tidy and flawless. Such a bright boy. His father sat on the school board. His mother ran the tie. Hoch, a very good family. The classroom door, which had remained open all year long, was conspicuously shut. She'd closed it after lunch without even thinking about why. On her desk sat a small bottle of hand sanitizer, the same one she'd used after handling Emily's plastic bag of wet clothes. Beside it, the class roster, next to Emily's name, sent home, dress code violation. The clock ticked again. 2:47 p.m., then came the knock. Soft. So soft she wasn't sure she'd actually heard it. A second knock followed, firmer this time. Deliberate. Knock, 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 knock. 3 beats. Even. Measured. Not urgent. Just final. The children looked up, their eyes wide, senses pricked by something different, something off. Joey Parker's smile vanished as he turned toward the door. Mrs. Peterson straightened, smoothed her blouse, steadied herself. Probably the principal. Maybe another suggestion about improving her tone. Or possibly, though highly unlikely, business trips always seem to align perfectly with parent-teacher meetings. He opened the door with a practiced smile already locked in. A man stood in the hallway, not tall by fantasy standards, but by presence. His frame filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, silver hair neatly trimmed, a simple button-down shirt and jeans, yet somehow they looked more formal than a tuxedo. But it was his eyes that made her step back, involuntarily. Ice blue, unblinking, eyes that weren't just looking at her, they were assessing her, reading her down to the marrow. Recognition crept over her like cold water, then slammed into her like a truck. Behind her, one of the students whispered, "Is that?" Another hissed, "My dad has all his movies." Mrs. Peterson's hand gripped the doorknob as her world shifted under her sensible flats. She'd seen this man before in movies, on late-night interviews, even framed on the school gym's motivational poster. Chuck Norris. He hadn't spoken yet, didn't need to. His presence filled the room like a silent verdict. Not loud, not theatrical, just there, immovable, final. The classroom had fallen dead silent. Even Joey was frozen, pencil dangling from his fingers. When Chuck finally spoke, his voice was gentle, southern, almost soothing, which somehow made his words far more lethal. "Mrs. Peterson," he said evenly, as if confirming something already known. "I believe you sent my granddaughter home today without pants." Each word hit with measured precision. No rush, no exaggeration, just fact. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her throat felt dry. Chuck's gaze never wavered. "Well, let's talk about that." Behind her, the small bottle of hand sanitizer suddenly seemed unreachable. And behind him, Principal Roberts appeared, face pale, like someone watching a live grenade roll across the floor. He started to speak, but stopped when Chuck raised one hand. Just slightly, enough to silence a room. It was the smallest of gestures, barely a motion of the hand, but somehow it silenced the world. The clock above the blackboard clicked to 2:50 p.m., and in that frozen breath of time, Mrs. Peterson understood something with crystal clarity. Her 27 years in the classroom, every conference, every policy memo, every gold star and reprimand, all of it meant nothing to the man standing in her doorway. Her authority, carefully built and polished like a fortress of routine and procedure, had just collided with a force far greater than herself. That knock hadn't just been a knock. It was the sound of consequences. "The children, continue with your math problems," she said, voice unsteady but trying. "Now, Mr. Parker, you're in charge while I step out." Joey's chest puffed up with importance. He nodded, as if he'd just been promoted to sergeant in a war zone. Chuck Norris stepped aside, eyes never leaving the teacher, and allowed her to pass. Down the hall, Principal Roberts was already retreating like a man walking backward into a brewing storm, half aware of it, wholly unprepared. The small conference room across the corridor felt stale, the kind of airless space where truths get cornered and exposed. Mrs. Peterson sat stiffly, hands folded tight on the tabletop. Across from her, Chuck lowered himself into the other chair, slow, deliberate, like a man in no rush because he already owned the moment. Between them lay only polished laminate and the wreckage of her once unchallenged authority. "I understand you're upset, Mr. Norris," she began, her professional tone returning. like a mask being reattached. But school policies, policy aside, Chuck interrupted softly, the gentleness of his voice only making it hit harder. I want to understand what happened. The fluorescent lights hummed above. Outside, a basketball bounced thud, 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 thud in eerie rhythm on the blacktop. Your granddaughter's pants were wet, she explained. She couldn't stay in class like that. Chuck gave a slow nod, acknowledging the logistics. In the nurse's office? The emergency clothes? Mrs. Peterson's hands clenched a little tighter. They aren't always sanitary, she said, her voice quieter now. I see. Chuck leaned in slightly, not threatening, but uncomfortably close to the truth. So instead, you sent a 7-year-old girl out of this building, wearing only a shirt. Alone, exposed, each word landed like thunder in a canyon. Her shirt was long enough, she insisted, though her voice now trembled. And her home is close by. Mrs. Peterson hesitated. Chuck pressed forward, calm but relentless. Did she violate a school rule, Mrs. Peterson? One that called for disciplinary action? This wasn't punishment, she stammered. It was a practical solution to a problem that another student created. Joey Parker, Chuck said. Not a question, a fact. Mrs. Peterson blinked. He said it was an accident. And you believed him? Yes. Joey's a very honest child. His father's on the school board, and I made some calls before coming here, Chuck cut in. So I know exactly who his father is. The implication settled between them like a quiet verdict. Mr. Norris, she tried again, softer now. I've been teaching for 27 years. I know how to handle situations like this. Chuck didn't move, but his eyes, the kind of eyes that once stared down mercenaries, locked onto hers. And something in them made her stop cold. Would you have sent your own daughter home like that? He asked. The question hit with surgical precision. Mrs. Peterson's mind flickered. Her daughter, now a lawyer in Boston, tall and confident. But once long ago, she was just a small child with tangled hair and scraped knees. The image of her walking home in nothing but a shirt suddenly wasn't hypothetical. That's not a fair comparison, she whispered. I disagree, Chuck replied, voice calm as ever. I think it's the only comparison that matters. The clock ticked in the silence. Mrs. Peterson couldn't look up. You humiliated my granddaughter today, Chuck continued. You chose classroom convenience over her dignity, over her safety. Now, that wasn't my intent. Intentions matter less than actions. He stood, and in that moment, his quiet presence filled the room like a shadow stretching across a battlefield. And your actions failed a child who trusted you. Mrs. Peterson didn't move. She hadn't felt this small in decades. What happens now? She asked at last, barely audible. Chuck's expression softened, just enough to reveal the man behind the myth. Not the movie star, not the icon, a grandfather and a protector. And now, he said, we make sure this never happens again. He turned to leave. She didn't follow. And in 27 years of teaching, she realized no student, not even the unruly ones, had ever taught her as much as the man who'd just walked out. Principal Roberts stood in the hallway, shoulders hunched, as if preparing to take a punch. When Chuck emerged, the man straightened fast. Mr. Norris, he began nervously. I want to assure you that Westwood Elementary takes student welfare very seriously. Oh, what happened today? Chuck said, cutting in. It was a symptom, not the disease. The principal blinked, caught mid-script. I want copies of your school policies, Chuck continued, particularly those dealing with dress code and emergency procedures. Of course. I'll have my secretary. Now, those two words, quiet, steady, moved the principal like a cattle prod. He disappeared into his office without another syllable. Chuck remained outside, watching. Students passed by, casting curious glances, whispers trailing in their wake. Some recognized him immediately. Others just felt the shift in gravity. Mrs. Peterson exited the conference room, pale and unsteady, moving toward her classroom with a ghost-like air. Her heels no longer clicked with confidence. Then the bell rang. The hallway exploded with life. Students rushing, books clutched, sneakers squeaking. But when they passed Chuck Norris, their voices dropped to hushed tone. Something about him didn't belong to their world of fractions and cafeteria pizza. And then, around the corner, a boy came too fast, colliding with a girl holding a cardboard solar system. It crashed. Planets rolled in all directions. Painted foam bounced across the polished linoleum. "I'm a project." The girl cried, dropping to her knees. Saturn rolled under a locker. Neptune vanished beneath a bench. The boy hesitated, looked at her, looked at the planets. Then he kept walking, head down, pretending not to see. Chuck stepped forward. No hesitation. He knelt beside the girl, his movements deliberate, gentle, respectful. "May I help?" he asked. She nodded, eyes wide, not just with recognition, but with the realization that someone saw her. And as Chuck Norris gathered the fallen planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, the hallway fell quiet again. Students formed a slow circle around them, watching, listening, learning, not from a textbook, but from a lesson none of them would ever forget. Unfiltered wisdom, then gave a small nod and nestled against him. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the tree branches like nature itself was holding its breath for what came next. Across town, the news had already begun to trickle through text threads and whispered parent group chats. Chuck Norris had shown up at Westwood Elementary, and things were no longer business as usual. That quiet ripple was now gathering momentum. People weren't just curious. They were alert. They were paying attention. Meanwhile, inside a quiet corner of the school district office, a janitor named Greg leaned on his mop, eyes narrowing as he scrolled through a thread on his phone. "Huh," he muttered, reading a comment. He kneeled down to help a kid pick up her planets. Real planets. Like Saturn. And said things can be fixed if people care enough. Greg didn't know Chuck Norris, but he recognized something he hadn't seen in years: accountability with a pulse. At that exact moment, a middle-aged woman in a navy pantsuit stood on her porch 2 counties over, her phone lighting up with the same message from the Department of Education. Catherine Reynolds wasn't just sending an observer tomorrow. She was coming herself. Because what Chuck had said on the phone stuck with her, clawed at her even after they hung up. Justice, not vengeance. Back in Chuck's living room, the atmosphere was steady, warm, but beneath it, something was brewing, something unstoppable. He checked his watch, calculating how much time Emily's parents would need to make it from the airport. Then he returned to the documents spread before him, scanning the emergency protocol section once more, highlighting phrases like a child welfare priority and a minimum standard of care. He didn't need to be a lawyer. He just needed to be who he was. A man who didn't walk away when something was broken. A man who stayed and helped pick up the pieces. Who questioned the policy if the policy didn't protect? Who stood between a child and the careless systems meant to serve them? Emily stirred again, tiny fingers wrapping around his. "Are you mad at my teacher?" she asked sleepily, voice muffled by the blanket. Chuck paused, then spoke quietly. No, sweetheart, I'm not mad. But I am making sure she learns something important." "A what?" "That what we do to others matters more than what we meant to do." Outside, the sun dipped lower, streaking the living room walls in amber light. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. A car engine revved. Life, as it always does, kept moving, but Chuck sat still, anchoring the moment. The calm before a reckoning. Tomorrow, the school board would meet. Names would be read. Statements given. Procedures dissected. But this wasn't about the minutes of a meeting or the language in a dusty handbook. This was about the silence between the lines, the kind of silence a 7-year-old feels when she walks home alone, soaked in shame. And Chuck knew that if you wanted to fix something broken, you didn't just sweep up the pieces. You built something stronger in its place. The next morning, before dawn even touched the rooftops, headlights cut through the darkened parking lot of Westwood Elementary. One by one, cars pulled in. Some carried board members. One carried Catherine Reynolds, her heels clicking like a metronome of purpose as she stepped out. And another, black, unassuming, carried Chuck and his granddaughter. Emily held his hand tighter than usual. "You ready?" Chuck asked. She nodded once. As the doors to the school opened, a whisper cut through the air like static. "He's here!" Not with fists, not with fury, but with something far more dangerous to broken systems. The truth, unfair judgment based on appearance or financial status. They are not mandatory, but they are available to every student equally. A gift, not a rule, a reminder that dignity isn't earned. It belongs to you simply because you exist. Yours sincerely, a friend who cares. The classroom was completely silent now, the kind of silence where you could feel everyone thinking at once. A few kids looked down at their uniforms again, as if seeing them in a different light. Others exchanged glances, some confused, some humbled. Emily stared at her package, the edges of the clear wrapping reflecting the morning sun. She turned the small card over in her hands, wondering who had written the letter. She already knew, of course. She just didn't know if anyone else had figured it out. The substitute teacher reappeared briefly in the doorway, handing a small stack of envelopes to Principal Roberts, who nodded and whispered something before stepping back into his office. Mrs. Peterson, still holding the letter, looked up at her students and said softly, "This is about more than clothes." Across the hallway, Joey Parker examined his uniform with the awkward uncertainty of someone not sure whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. He looked over at Emily and gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod. The kind boys do when they don't know how to say more than a thanks or I get it now. Emily gave a small nod back. Later that day, as the final bell rang and students poured out into the hallways, the atmosphere had noticeably shifted, not loud, but lighter. As if the school itself had exhaled, backpacks bounced on shoulders. New uniforms rustled softly. No one quite knew how to explain the difference, but they felt it, like something that had been out of place for too long had finally been set right. Chuck's truck rolled slowly into the pickup lane. Emily ran to it. New jacket zipped halfway up, her step lighter than it had been in days. "Hey," he said as she climbed in. "Hey," she replied, sliding into her seat. "How was your day?" She paused, thought about the apology, the gift, the quote on the board, the kids in their uniforms, thought about Mrs. Peterson's eyes as she said sorry, and meant it. "It was good," Emily said, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Really good." Chuck smiled, eyes on the road ahead. "Glad to hear it." As they drove, Emily looked out the window, watching the school fade behind them. The boxes, the whispers, the tensions of the last week. They were still there, but their weight had changed. They were no longer burdens. They were lessons, scars healing into strength. Back at home, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in honey-colored streaks, Chuck sat once again at his kitchen table. The school policy binder was closed now, resting beside a folder labeled "Irresolved." He didn't plan to open it again anytime soon. Not unless he had to. He poured himself a cup of tea and glanced at the television, where a news anchor was reporting on a proposed state policy to provide optional uniforms for elementary schools across the region. It had started with a pilot donation in a small district. The anchor said, anonymous, but clearly significant. Catherine Reynolds appeared on screen for a brief statement, her voice composed but purposeful. We often talk about reform in abstract terms. But sometimes change begins with one child, one act of courage, one community that chooses to see the truth. Chuck turned the volume down and leaned back in his chair. He hadn't done any of it to be seen, and yet things had been seen. Not just by cameras or by school officials, but by children, watching adults for what they did when it really counted. That was the measure of any real protector. Not the noise they made, but the peace they left behind. Emily came into the room, a notebook tucked under her arm. "Can you help me with something?" she asked. "Sure. Homework?" She nodded. "I have to write about someone who inspires me." Chuck chuckled. "Well, I hope you've got a long list." She sat across from him and opened the notebook to a blank page. "I do," she said quietly, "but I already know who I'm starting with." Chuck didn't ask who. He just watched her begin to write, the quiet scratch of her pencil moving steadily across the paper. He sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through him as slowly and surely as the ripple of change still echoing from a single day that had started like any other, until a girl walked home alone. And her grandfather chose not to let it end there, because some stories don't just end. They transformed. The nurse's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, now stocked with new emergency clothing in various sizes, along with personal care kits, each one neatly labeled and ready for students who might need them. The note accompanying it all reads simply, "Education should elevate, not diminish. A friend of Westwood." Mrs. Peterson read the final line aloud, her voice trembling ever so slightly before folding the letter with reverence. Her eyes briefly met Emily's, just long enough for something quiet and meaningful to pass between them. Sophia leaned in, her fingers running over the soft fabric of her jacket. "Do you think this was your grandfather?" she whispered. Emily shook her head. "I don't think so. He took me for ice cream yesterday. He didn't say anything about uniforms." At the front of the room, Mrs. Peterson discovered another envelope tucked beneath the donation letter. Her name was written on the front in an elegant, almost calligraphic hand. She opened it privately, fingers hesitating for a heartbeat before revealing the note inside. It was a simple card with just one line. "Heroes don't wear capes. They teach lessons. No name, no address." Nothing but those 9 words. And yet they made her fingers tremble as she quietly slid the card into her desk drawer, her thoughts racing. It was as if someone had reached into her heart and gently reminded her of who she used to be. That evening, as Emily and her mother organized the new uniforms in her closet, her mother lifted one of the jackets and nodded approvingly. "These are really nice quality," she said. "It looks like the school board finally got something right." Emily traced the stitched school logo with her fingers, thoughtful. "But do you think Grandpa had anything to do with this?" Her mother paused, the faintest smile pulling at her lips. "Your grandfather's always believed actions speak louder than words." "But no, he's never needed credit for the things he does. That's not his style." Outside, as dusk crept in and the porch light flicked on, Chuck sat on the back steps, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried easily through the open kitchen window. "Yes, they were delivered today. Every student got one. No connection needs to be made." "Just let it happen quietly," he said, chuckling at something the caller on the other end said. "Mike, sometimes the best way to change a system is from within. Give them the tools, not just a speech. Let them fix what's broken instead of just pointing at the cracks." Emily paused in her homework to listen. She didn't say anything, just smiled to herself and went back to her math. Comforted by a quiet truth, some things you just knew, like how the sun would rise in the morning, or how her grandfather would never let injustice go unanswered. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peterson sat alone at her desk after class, staring at the card again. "Heroes don't wear capes. They teach lessons." It echoed through her like a bell. Well, she'd been teaching for 27 years. But this past week had changed her more profoundly than all the decades combined. By the time 2 weeks passed, spring had painted the school grounds in color. Yellow daffodils lined the walkway. Pink cherry blossoms framed the front doors. And the air, for the first time in a while, felt full of possibility. Emily stood at the school gate, dressed in her uniform. The navy blue polo shirt and khakis had become part of the daily rhythm at Westwood Elementary, stripping away status, softening judgments. Children no longer competed through brands or appearance. They stood equal at the start of every day. "You ready?" her mom asked, unlocking the car. Emily nodded, then straightened her shoulders. "I can walk from here." Her mother hesitated. "You sure, sweetie? I can walk you up." Emily smiled. "I'm sure. It's only to the door." As she joined the flow of students, her stride was different now. No hunching, no downcast eye. She returned waves and greetings like she belonged. Not because she'd won some imaginary game, but because the rules had changed. She had changed. Across the street, a silver truck idled behind a hedge. Chuck watched from the driver's seat, arms folded, sunglasses perched low on his nose. He'd extended his visit under the pretense of writing a new book, but the truth was simpler. He needed to be sure the shift he'd helped initiate had taken hold. And it had. He watched Emily disappear into the school, head high, step steady. That invisible armor, the kind built from dignity, not defense, was fully in place now. Inside, the effects rippled. Mrs. Peterson returned from a professional development retreat with new ideas about restorative justice and conflict resolution. Principal Roberts implemented formal procedures to handle clothing-related issues, and the school board funded a full-time counselor for the fall. Small ripples, but lasting ones. Chuck watched a few final students scramble through the doors before the bell rang. He pressed his phone to his ear one last time. Catherine, it's Chuck. I'm heading back to Texas tomorrow. Yeah, everything's settled here. The uniforms were a good call. Your contact at the education department came through just in time. He paused, eyes scanning the entryway. No, I don't think they'll backslide. The board signed off on the policy last night. The culture's shifting. He leaned forward slightly as a late-arriving car pulled up and Joey Parker hopped out. The kid sprinted to the door, backpack bouncing, shirt slightly askew, but something in his demeanor was different. Less cocky, more grounded, humbled maybe, Chuck nodded to himself. Even Joey, he's changed too. Consequences will do that, for kids and grown-ups alike. He shifted the truck into drive, slowly pulling away. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic ending. Just the steady hum of an engine, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had planted something deep and watched it take root. As he passed the school one last time, he caught a glimpse through the main windows. Emily walking through the hallway, flanked by friends, smiling, confident, unafraid. A snapshot of transformation. The memory of that first day, her slumped shoulders, tear-streaked face, her shame as raw as a wound, flickered beside it and faded. Not every battle is won with force. Some are won with resilience, with conviction, with quietly relentless hope. Chuck turned onto the highway, the road stretching out before him. He didn't need a medal or applause. He didn't need anyone to know what he'd done. Because real heroes don't need capes. They just show up, do the work, and leave the world a little better than they found it.